July 21st, 1918. A damp German dugout near Château Thierry, France. Obergefreiter Klaus Richter examined the captured American weapon with barely concealed amusement, turning the shortened Winchester Model 1897 over in his hands. The heat shield was perforated with neat holes, a bayonet lug sprouted from beneath the truncated barrel, and the entire contraption looked like something a gentleman might use to hunt ducks on a Sunday morning. Jagdgewehr, he muttered to his companion, using the German word for hunting rifle. The Americans bring bird guns to fight the Kaiser. The prisoner who had carried this weapon, a young soldier from the 307th Infantry, 77th Division, sat silently in the corner of the dugout, his hands bound with telegraph wire. He had been captured during a failed reconnaissance probe, one of the earliest documented encounters between German forces and what the Americans were beginning to call their trench gun. What Richter didn't understand, as he hefted the unfamiliar weapon, was that he was holding an instrument that would soon transform the entire character of trench warfare and ultimately provoke an international diplomatic crisis. The German Army's initial reaction to American shotguns was rooted in 4 years of European combat experience. Since 1914, warfare had evolved into a precise science of industrial killing. Bolt-action rifles with effective ranges of 800 meters, machine guns that could sweep entire sections of no man's land, artillery pieces that could drop shells into trenches from distances measured in kilometers. Combat had become a long-range affair, fought by men who rarely saw their enemies clearly. Into this world of measured distances and calculated trajectories came the Americans with their shortened shotguns, and to German eyes, the weapon seemed almost quaint. Hauptmann Friedrich von Lossberg, a veteran of Verdun and the Somme, wrote in his journal after examining captured American equipment, "These shotguns appear to be sporting weapons, shortened and fitted with military hardware. The Americans seem to believe they can fight a modern war with farmers' tools. Such innocence would be touching if it were not so dangerous to their own men." The technical specifications of the American trench guns reinforced German assumptions about their ineffectiveness. The Winchester Model 1897, even in its military configuration, had an effective range of perhaps 40 meters with buckshot. Compare this to the German Mauser-Gewehr 98, accurate to 500 meters in the hands of a trained marksman. The shotgun's 12-gauge shells, each containing 9 .33 caliber pellets, seemed primitive compared to the precisely engineered 7.92 millimeters Mauser cartridges that could pierce steel helmets at distance. More than 1 million Model 1897 shotguns had been produced by Winchester across all variants, but the military versions reaching French battlefields represented a tiny fraction of American armament. Most were drawn from existing Winchester stock and special government purchases made hastily in 1917 and 1918. Remington contributed approximately 3,500 Model 10 trench guns as a secondary supplier, fitted with 23.5-inch barrels and clamped bayonet adapters. To German intelligence officers analyzing captured weapons, these numbers seemed insignificant compared to the millions of rifles being produced by all combatants. The German military establishment's dismissal of shotguns was reinforced by European experience earlier in the war. British and French forces had evaluated shotguns in 1915 and 1916, but rejected them for frontline issue due to persistent problems with damp conditions and unreliable ammunition. Paper-wound cartridges tended to misfire in waterlogged trenches, and the weapons required specialized ammunition that complicated already strained logistics networks. From the German perspective, the American decision to press shotguns into service seemed to confirm their assessment of American military naivety. Here was a nation that had entered the war late, with minimal combat experience, attempting to solve the complex problems of trench warfare with hunting weapons. General Major Ludwig von Falkenhausen, observing American preparations from German positions near Saint-Mihiel, reported to High Command. The enemy appears to be experimenting with shortened hunting rifles. This suggests either desperation or a fundamental misunderstanding of modern warfare. We expect these weapons to prove as ineffective as they appear. The mockery extended beyond military circles. German newspapers, when they mentioned American shotguns at all, treated them as curiosities. The Kölnische Zeitung ran a brief item in August 1918 describing captured Jagdflinten hunting shotguns as evidence of American supply shortages. The enemy has been reduced to arming his soldiers with sporting weapons, the article noted. This speaks to the effectiveness of our submarine campaign against American industrial capacity. German soldiers in the trenches adopted the term Spielzeuggewehr, toy gun, when referring to captured American shotguns. Letters home frequently mention these weapons as evidence of American military incompetence. Unteroffizier Hans Weber wrote to his wife in Bavaria, "You should see the ridiculous weapons the Americans carry. Short little hunting guns that belong in the hands of boys shooting rabbits, not men fighting the fatherland." It makes one wonder how such a nation expects to influence European affairs. The physical appearance of the American trench guns reinforced German preconceptions, with their truncated barrels cut to roughly 20 to 23.5 inches, perforated heat shields, and prominent bayonet lugs. They looked improvised, almost crude compared to the elegant lines of German military rifles. The weapons were typically issued with buckshot cartridges, rather than the rifle ammunition used throughout European armies, requiring separate logistics chains and specialized handling procedures that seemed to complicate rather than simplify combat operations. What German observers failed to understand was the strategic thinking behind American shotgun deployment. These weapons were not intended to replace rifles in general combat. Instead, they were specialized tools designed for specific tactical situations that would become increasingly common as American forces adopted aggressive trench-clearing tactics. The shotguns were issued to selected squads, typically 6 to 12 men, who would be tasked with sudden, brutal close assaults on enemy positions. The Americans had recognized something that European armies, locked in defensive mindsets after 4 years of attritional warfare, had missed: the critical importance of close-quarters combat in trench systems. While European forces focused on holding ground and maintaining defensive lines, American doctrine emphasized rapid, violent assaults designed to clear enemy trenches and establish new positions. For this type of fighting, traditional rifles were actually poorly suited. Lieutenant Wilhelm Hoffmann, captured near Cantigny in May 1918, provided one of the most detailed early German assessments of American trench tactics. In his interrogation report, he noted, "The Americans attack differently than the French or British. They move quickly, in small groups, and seem to prefer fighting at very close range. Their officers train them for hand-to-hand combat in ways that would seem primitive to German standards. Perhaps their shotguns are intended to support this crude but aggressive approach." The German Army's confidence in its assessment of American shotguns was bolstered by the apparent success of German defensive tactics. Throughout 1917 and early 1918, the Spring Offensive, launched in March 1918, had demonstrated German tactical superiority despite being ultimately unsuccessful in achieving strategic objectives. German stormtroopers had pioneered techniques for clearing enemy trenches using rifle grenades, light machine guns, and flamethrowers. These weapons had proven effective in close combat, and to German minds, they represented the proper evolution of trench warfare technology. The psychological dimension of German mockery cannot be understated. After 4 years of grinding warfare, German soldiers had developed a professional pride in their military competence. They had fought the British Empire to a standstill, contained French offensives, and defeated Russia. The arrival of American forces equipped with what appeared to be improvised hunting weapons, seemed almost insulting to veterans who had survived Verdun, Passchendaele, and Brusilov's offensive. This confidence would prove catastrophically misplaced. The Americans arriving in France in 1918 brought more than just unusual weapons. They brought a different philosophy of warfare, one that would soon demonstrate the devastating effectiveness of shotguns in the confined spaces of trench systems. The mockery that filled German letters and reports in the summer of 1918 would soon give way to something far different: terror, outrage, and ultimately, a formal diplomatic protest that would elevate a simple hunting weapon into an instrument of international controversy. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic reversals of military opinion in modern history. German soldiers who laughed at American toy guns in July would be writing desperate reports about trench brooms by September. The weapon they dismissed as a farmer's tool would soon earn a reputation so fearsome that the German government would threaten to execute any American prisoner found carrying one. September 12, 1918. Dawn was breaking over the St. Mihiel salient as American forces launched their first major independent offensive of the war. In a communication trench designated Graben Wilhelm by its German defenders, Gefreiter Ernst Zimmermann crouched behind a traverse, listening to the approaching footsteps on the duckboards. The preliminary bombardment had lifted 10 minutes ago, and now came the infantry, Americans from the 1st Division, moving through the labyrinth of trenches with a speed and violence that contradicted everything Zimmermann had been told about their tactical incompetence. The sound that reached him through the morning mist was unlike anything in his 3 years of combat experience. Not the measured crack of rifle fire or the chattering of machine guns, but something new, a rapid, stuttering bark that seemed to fill the confined space of the trench system. It was the sound of slam-firing Winchester Model 1,897 seconds, operated by men who had learned to hold the trigger while pumping the action, creating a rate of fire that dramatically exceeded anything possible with bolt-action rifles. Private First Class James Morrison of the 26th Infantry Regiment appeared around the traverse, his shortened Winchester leading the way. Morrison had grown up trap shooting on his family's farm in Iowa, and the weapon in his hands felt as natural as a farming tool. What felt natural to Morrison, however, appeared supernatural to Zimmermann. The American moved the shotgun's muzzle in a slow horizontal arc, a technique his instructors had called sweeping, designed to ensure that buckshot would strike timbers and occupants rather than relying on precise line-of-sight aiming. The discharge that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. 5 rapid shots that turned the traverse into a maelstrom of splintering wood, torn sandbags, and ricocheting pellets. Each 12-gauge shell contained 9 .33 caliber pellets, 45 projectiles total, creating a devastating pattern in the confined space. Zimmermann later wrote in his diary, discovered decades later in a bombed-out cellar in Berlin, "It was like being caught in a hailstorm of lead. The American weapon didn't fire a single bullet. It fired dozens at once. The wooden revetments exploded into splinters. Men screamed, not from single wounds, but from being struck by multiple projectiles simultaneously." This was the reality of the trench broom in action, and it shattered every German assumption about American military capabilities. The shotgun's limitation in range, perhaps 40 meters at maximum effectiveness, became irrelevant in trench systems, where the entire engagement envelope was often 20 to 30 meters. In these confined spaces, the weapon's spread pattern was not a disadvantage, but a devastating advantage, allowing one man to engage multiple targets simultaneously. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. German soldiers who had grown accustomed to the predictable patterns of rifle fire, single shots from specific positions that could be located and countered, found themselves facing a weapon that seemed to defy the basic rules of combat. Obergefreiter Heinrich Müller, captured during the Saint-Mihiel offensive, described his experience to American interrogators. The sound was wrong. Rifles go crack, machine guns go rat-tat-tat, but this American weapon went boom, 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 so fast the sounds ran together. And when it fired, everything in front of it was destroyed. Men, equipment, sandbags, timber supports. It was like fighting artillery at arm's length. The technical advantages of the American trench guns became apparent immediately. The slam fire capability of the Model 1897 allowed experienced operators to discharge 5 rounds in under 3 seconds, creating a brief but overwhelming volume of fire. When deployed in teams of 6 to 12 men, as American doctrine prescribed, this translated to potentially 60 projectiles, 540 individual pellets, delivered into a confined space in the span of a few heartbeats. Combat Engineer Sergeant Robert Hayes, who had served with trench clearing teams throughout the Meuse-Argonne offensive, recorded his observations in letters home. The Krauts just weren't prepared for what these guns could do in close quarters. We'd come around a traverse or into a dugout, and before they could bring their rifles to bear, we'd have swept the entire space clean. It wasn't fair, really, but fairness wasn't what we were there for. The effectiveness of the trench brooms was magnified by American tactical innovation. Rather than using shotguns as general-purpose infantry weapons, American commanders deployed them in specialized roles that maximized their advantages while minimizing their limitations. Trench clearing raids typically occurred at night or pre-dawn to maximize surprise, when the shotgun's limited range was less of a disadvantage. Teams would infiltrate enemy positions, use grenades and artillery to suppress resistance, then employ shotguns to clear dugouts and communication trenches where traditional rifles were unwieldy. The physical sensation of being engaged by buckshot created terror among German troops who encountered it. Survivors described being struck by what felt like dozens of simultaneous impacts, each pellet carrying enough energy to penetrate cloth, leather, and flesh. Unlike rifle bullets, which created single, precise wounds, buckshot created clusters of injuries that were both medically devastating and psychologically traumatic. Sanitator Wilhelm Koch, a German medical orderly, wrote in his journal, "The American hunting guns create wounds unlike anything we have seen, not clean bullet holes, but areas of shredded flesh where multiple projectiles have struck. The men who survive these weapons are often unable to fight again, not from physical incapacity alone, but from terror of facing them again." The sound profile of the trench guns added to their psychological impact. In the confined acoustic environment of dugouts and communication trenches, the multiple discharges of slam-firing shotguns created a sound that eyewitnesses described as overwhelming. The concussive effect of repeated 12-gauge discharges in enclosed spaces was disorienting even to those not directly engaged. Private David Patterson, serving with the 77th Division, noted, "You could hear the terror in the German voices after we'd hit them with the trench guns. They'd be shouting and screaming, not just from wounds, but from confusion. The sound of those guns echoing in their trenches was like nothing they'd ever heard." German attempts to counter the American shotguns initially focused on traditional defensive measures that proved inadequate to the task. Standard rifle training emphasized precise marksmanship at distance, skills that were useless in the confined spaces where shotguns were most effective. Machine gun emplacements designed to sweep no man's land could not be effectively repositioned to defend trench traverses and dugouts. Even German close combat weapons like rifle grenades and light machine guns required more time to deploy effectively than the Americans needed to close distance and discharge their shotguns. The logistical reality of trench gun ammunition also contributed to their effectiveness in ways German intelligence had not anticipated. While shotgun shells were indeed heavier and bulkier than rifle rounds, forcing American teams to carry fewer rounds, this limitation was offset by the devastating effectiveness of each discharge. A raiding party might carry only 50 to 100 shotgun shells per man, compared to the 200 to 300 rifle rounds typical for German infantry. But each shotgun shell delivered 9 projectiles, meaning that a fully equipped American trench-clearing team could deliver thousands of individual projectiles in a single engagement. The German medical service began documenting the unique wound patterns created by American shotguns, providing clinical evidence of their effectiveness. Dr. Hans Bergmann, Chief Medical Officer of the 5th Reserve Division, reported to German High Command, "Casualties from American hunting guns present wound characteristics not seen with conventional rifle fire, multiple entry points, extensive soft tissue damage, and high rates of secondary infection from clothing and debris driven into wounds." More significantly, the psychological trauma among survivors is extraordinary. Men who have survived artillery bombardments and machine gun attacks are requesting transfer from sectors where these American weapons are deployed. The effectiveness of the trench brooms was particularly evident in the specific tactical situations where they were employed. Communication trenches, those narrow passages that connected front-line positions to rear areas, became killing zones when Americans with shotguns gained access. The typical width of a communication trench, 2 to 3 feet, meant that the spread pattern of a 12-gauge shell could effectively engage the entire width of the passage. German soldiers caught in these confined spaces had no room to take cover and insufficient distance to bring rifles to bear effectively. Dugouts, the underground shelters where soldiers slept and stored equipment, became death traps when assaulted by trench gun teams. The standard German dugout, excavated to provide protection from artillery, typically measured 8 to 12 feet in width and 6 to 8 feet in height. In such confined spaces, a single shotgun discharge could disable every occupant simultaneously. American teams learned to work dugouts systematically. Grenades first to suppress and disorient, then shotguns to clear any remaining resistance. The traverse system that had been a key feature of trench design since 1915, zigzag patterns designed to limit the effect of enfilading fire, actually worked to the advantage of shotgun-equipped forces. Traditional rifles were less effective around sharp corners because they required line-of-sight engagement. Shotguns, with their spread patterns, could engage around corners and in situations where precise aiming was impossible. By October 1918, German frontline reports were painting a picture of a weapon system that was fundamentally changing the character of close combat operations. Hauptmann von Steuben, commanding the 23rd Reserve Infantry Regiment, reported to division headquarters, "The American hunting weapons have rendered traditional trench defense ineffective. Our riflemen cannot engage targets that appear suddenly at close range and discharge multiple projectiles before aimed fire can be returned. Standard defensive positions that have proven adequate against French and British assault are being overrun by small American teams equipped with these weapons." The transformation in German attitudes toward American shotguns was swift and profound. What had been dismissed as hunting toys in July were being described as revolutionary weapons by September. Letters from German soldiers to families back home began reflecting not mockery, but genuine fear and respect for American tactical innovation. The stage was set for the escalation that would transform a tactical weapon into an international diplomatic crisis. October 4th, 1918. Argonne Forest, France. The morning mist hung thick between the shattered trees as Unteroffizier Max Weber pressed his back against the muddy wall of a shell crater, listening to the Americans methodically clearing the trench system his company had held for 6 months. The sound had become horrifyingly familiar. The wet slap of boots on duckboards, shouted commands in American English, and then the distinctive bark of multiple shotguns firing in rapid succession. "Sie komme mit den Fegern," Weber whispered to the terrified private beside him, using the German nickname that had emerged for the American trench guns. The sweepers, the brooms. What had begun as mockery had evolved into something approaching superstitious dread. Weber had survived the Somme and Passchendaele, had faced British steel and French fury, but nothing in his 3 years of combat had prepared him for the systematic, intimate brutality of American trench-clearing operations. The Meuse-Argonne offensive had begun on September 26th, and with it, the widespread deployment of American trench gun teams across a 24-mile front. What had been isolated encounters during earlier engagements now became standard operating procedure. American forces, organized into specialized assault teams, were systematically dismantling German defensive positions that had been considered impregnable since 1916. The scale of American shotgun deployment during Meuse-Argonne dwarfed earlier operations. Intelligence estimates suggested that American forces were employing trench guns at a ratio of approximately 1 per 12-man squad in assault formations. This meant thousands of shotguns were operating simultaneously across the front, creating a new tactical reality that German commanders were struggling to comprehend. Oberst Friedrich von Lossberg, the same officer who had dismissed American shotguns as farmers' tools in July, filed a very different report in October. The enemy's systematic use of shortened hunting weapons has fundamentally altered the tactical situation. Traditional defensive measures are proving inadequate. The psychological effect on our troops is becoming as significant as the physical casualties. Men who have demonstrated courage under artillery bombardment are requesting reassignment to avoid sectors where these weapons are deployed. The American tactical doctrine for trench gun employment had evolved rapidly through combat experience. By October 1918, standard operating procedures called for teams of 6 to 12 men, typically including 2 to 3 shotgun operators, 4 to 6 riflemen with grenades, and 2 to 3 pistol-armed officers. These teams moved through trench systems with industrial efficiency, clearing sections in 5 to 20-minute engagements that left German positions silent and evacuated. The sound signature of these operations became a source of terror that extended far beyond the actual engagement zones. Private William Henderson of the 82nd Division noted in his diary, "You can hear the Krauts evacuating their trenches when they hear us coming with the trench guns. The sound of those shotguns echoing through their tunnels sends them running before we even get close. It's like the weapons have developed a reputation that does half our work for us." German frontline units began developing desperate countermeasures. Some companies attempted to block communication trenches with wire and debris to slow American advance. Others tried positioning machine guns to cover traverse entrances, though this proved ineffective against teams that used grenades to suppress defensive positions before closing with shotguns. A few units experimented with their own close combat weapons, including captured American trench guns, but lacked the training and tactical doctrine to employ them effectively. The medical evidence of shotgun effectiveness was becoming undeniable. German field hospitals were reporting wound patterns that differed dramatically from traditional combat injuries. Dr. Wilhelm Braun, chief surgeon of the 77th Reserve Division, documented his observations in a report that would later be found in captured medical records. Casualties from American Flintengewehr present multiple simultaneous entry wounds in cluster patterns. The psychological trauma is extraordinary. Soldiers who survive these weapons often suffer from what appears to be persistent nervous disorders, exhibiting extreme startle responses to loud sounds and refusing to enter confined spaces. The reputation of American trench guns spread through the German army via the informal communication networks that existed in all military organizations. Soldiers on leave carried stories back to reserve units. Medical personnel treating shotgun casualties discussed the unique wound patterns. Intelligence officers compiled reports that, while intended for headquarters, were often read by subordinates who spread the information further. By November 1918, the German nickname Grabenfeger, trench sweeper, had become standard terminology in frontline units. Letters home, when they passed censorship, frequently mentioned these weapons as symbols of American military innovation and German tactical obsolescence. Gefreiter Hans Müller wrote to his brother in Hamburg, "The Americans have invented a way to fight that makes our training worthless. Their sweeping guns can clear an entire trench section in minutes. We call them Fager because they sweep everything clean, leaving nothing alive behind them." The psychological impact extended beyond individual soldiers to entire military formations. German units began requesting reassignment to sectors where American forces were not active, specifically to avoid encountering trench gun teams. Some regiments reported discipline problems as soldiers abandoned positions when they heard the distinctive sound of approaching American assault teams. The 234th Reserve Infantry Regiment recorded 47 cases of combat fatigue in October 1918, many specifically related to encounters with American shotgun teams. American military intelligence recognized the psychological advantage they had gained and began incorporating sound tactics into their operations. Teams were instructed to chamber rounds audibly when approaching German positions, allowing the distinctive metallic sound of shotgun actions to announce their presence. Some units used captured German loudspeakers to broadcast the sound of chambering shotguns into enemy trenches before attacks, creating panic without actual engagement. The effectiveness of these psychological operations was documented in German intelligence reports. Hauptmann Rudolf Steiner, intelligence officer for the 18th Reserve Corps, reported, "The sound of American trench weapons being prepared for firing has become as effective as their actual employment. Our forward observers report German troops evacuating positions upon hearing these distinctive sounds, even when no actual attack follows. The enemy appears to be exploiting the reputation their weapons have gained among our forces." The logistical burden on German medical services was becoming severe. Shotgun casualties required different treatment protocols than traditional rifle wounds, placing additional strain on medical personnel already stretched by 4 years of warfare. The multiple entry wounds, typical of buckshot, required extensive surgical intervention, while the psychological trauma demanded resources that field medical units were not equipped to provide. German attempts to capture and study American trench guns intensified during this period. Intelligence teams were specifically tasked with obtaining samples of American shotgun ammunition and detailed technical specifications of the weapons themselves. However, these efforts yielded information that only reinforced German concerns about the weapon's effectiveness. Analysis of captured Winchester Model 1,897 seconds revealed design features that maximized their utility in trench warfare. The slam fire capability, the ease of maintenance in muddy conditions, and the devastating stopping power of 12-gauge buckshot at close range. The industrial implications of American shotgun deployment were becoming apparent to German strategic planners. Unlike specialized military weapons that required dedicated production facilities, the American trench guns were essentially modified sporting weapons produced by existing civilian manufacturers. Winchester and Remington had demonstrated the ability to adapt commercial production lines to military requirements rapidly and in large quantities. This suggested that American forces could potentially equip entire divisions with these weapons if they chose to do so. German propaganda efforts struggled to address the growing reputation of American trench guns without inadvertently spreading fear among their own troops. Military censors faced the challenge of acknowledging the weapon's existence, since frontline soldiers were encountering them regularly, while minimizing their apparent effectiveness. Most attempts at propaganda focused on portraying the weapons as violations of civilized warfare, laying the groundwork for what would become a formal diplomatic protest. The escalation culminated in a series of engagements during the final weeks of October 1918 that would provide the specific incidents used to justify German diplomatic action. On October 23rd, American forces from the 1st Division conducted a trench clearing operation against positions held by the 450th Infantry Regiment near Grand Pre. The engagement lasted approximately 45 minutes and resulted in the complete evacuation of a trench system that had been held by German forces for over 2 years. The German survivors of this engagement provided testimony that would later appear in diplomatic documents. Lieutenant Otto Kramer, one of only 3 officers to escape the American assault, filed a report that described the systematic destruction of his command. The Americans advanced with their sweeping weapons in coordinated teams. Each traverse was cleared in minutes. The sound of these weapons firing simultaneously created confusion that prevented organized resistance. My men fled not from cowardice, but from the impossibility of effective defense against these hunting guns used as military weapons. Similar incidents occurred throughout the final phase of the Meuse-Argonne offensive. German High Command was receiving reports from multiple sectors describing the same tactical phenomenon. Small American teams, equipped with shortened shotguns, were systematically destroying German defensive positions that conventional attacks had been unable to breach. The weapons that had been dismissed as sporting curiosities were proving to be revolutionary instruments of trench warfare. The cumulative effect of these encounters was creating a crisis of morale that extended far beyond the immediate combat zones. German soldiers in reserve positions were hearing detailed accounts of American trench gun effectiveness from wounded comrades and refugees from overrun positions. The weapons had developed a reputation that made them effective psychological weapons, even when they were not physically present. By early November 1918, German diplomatic and military authorities were facing the reality that American shotguns had become a significant factor in the collapse of German defensive capabilities on the Western Front. The weapons that had been mocked as hunting toys had evolved into symbols of American tactical innovation and German military obsolescence. The stage was set for a diplomatic crisis that would transform individual weapons into symbols of international law and military ethics. The German government was preparing to take the extraordinary step of formally protesting the use of these weapons to the United States government, threatening to execute any American prisoners found carrying them. What had begun as tactical mockery was about to become an international incident that would elevate the humble shotgun into one of the most controversial weapons of the Great War. September 19th, 1918. The German Foreign Ministry, Berlin. Staatssekretär Wilhelm Solf reviewed the documents spread across his mahogany desk with growing consternation. Reports from the Western Front painted a picture of systematic German defensive failures, and at the center of these failures was a weapon that challenged fundamental assumptions about civilized warfare. The formal diplomatic protest he was preparing to send to the United States government would represent one of the most unusual complaints in the history of international relations, a sovereign nation demanding that its enemies stop using hunting shotguns in military combat. The document that emerged from this process, delivered to the U.S. State Department on September 19, 1918, and filed as Document 911 inches, the Foreign Relations Archives, represented the culmination of months of growing German outrage over American trench gun tactics. The protest declared that American use of pump-action shotguns violated the laws of war and stated unequivocally that any prisoner captured found to have in his possession such guns or ammunition belonging thereto forfeits his life. The German argument rested on Article 23A of the 1907 Hague Convention, which forbade weapons causing unnecessary suffering. German legal scholars argued that shotgun pellets, spreading in random patterns and creating multiple simultaneous wounds, constituted a form of warfare that exceeded the bounds of military necessity. Dr. Heinrich Triepel, Germany's leading authority on international law, provided the theoretical foundation for the protest in a lengthy memorandum. The American hunting weapons discharge multiple projectiles in patterns that cannot be controlled or directed with precision. This creates suffering beyond what is required for military effectiveness and violates the fundamental principle that weapons should disable combatants efficiently rather than inflicting gratuitous injury. The American response, crafted by Secretary of State Robert Lansing and delivered through diplomatic channels within 72 hours, rejected German arguments with methodical precision. The U.S. legal position, developed in consultation with military and civilian legal experts, compared shotguns to other accepted deadly weapons and refused the prohibition. The German protest rests on a misinterpretation of international law, Lansing's response declared. Shotguns are no more inherently inhumane than bayonets, artillery shells, or machine gun bullets. The laws of war prohibit unnecessary suffering, not effective weapons that achieve military objectives rapidly. More significantly, the American reply included a warning that would prove to be the most important diplomatic language of the entire exchange. Executing captured Americans for carrying shotguns would bring immediate reprisals against German prisoners in American custody. This threat, backed by the industrial capacity that German prisoners had witnessed firsthand during their captivity, effectively ended German consideration of carrying out their execution threats. The diplomatic crisis revealed the broader tensions between traditional European military culture and American approaches to warfare. German military thought, developed through decades of Prussian military theory and 4 years of European combat, emphasized precision, order, and controlled violence within established parameters. American military doctrine, influenced by frontier warfare traditions and industrial problem-solving approaches, prioritized effectiveness over convention. General Major Erich Ludendorff, effectively commanding the German war effort, had reviewed detailed reports on American shotgun employment before the diplomatic protest was filed. His analysis, found in captured German high command documents after the war, revealed the strategic thinking behind the protest. The American hunting weapons represent a departure from European military tradition that, if allowed to become normalized, will fundamentally alter the character of warfare. These weapons make traditional defensive preparations inadequate and force close combat under conditions where training and discipline become less relevant than industrial capacity. The German protest was also motivated by concerns about post-war implications. If shotguns proved effective in trench warfare, other nations might adopt similar weapons, potentially rendering obsolete the military technologies and tactics in which Germany had invested heavily since 1870. The diplomatic protest was, in part, an attempt to establish legal precedent that would prevent widespread adoption of American-style close combat weapons. American military leaders recognized the broader implications of the German protest. General John J. Pershing, commanding the American Expeditionary Forces, responded to State Department inquiries with characteristic directness. The enemy's protest reveals their recognition that our trench guns are extraordinarily effective. They seek through diplomacy to eliminate weapons they cannot counter on the battlefield. This suggests we should increase rather than decrease our employment of these systems. The technical aspects of the controversy were exhaustively debated in classified military and diplomatic communications. German experts argued that buckshot created ragged wounds that were inherently more inhumane than clean bullet wounds. American medical officers countered with clinical evidence demonstrating that properly placed buckshot was actually more likely to cause rapid incapacitation than rifle bullets, potentially reducing overall suffering by ending engagements more quickly. Dr. Harvey Cushing, the renowned American surgeon who served in France during 1917 to 1918, provided medical testimony that supported American legal arguments. Shotgun wounds, while appearing more traumatic due to their multiple entry points, often prove less likely to cause prolonged suffering than single rifle bullets that may lodge in vital organs without causing immediate incapacitation. From a purely medical perspective, weapons that end combat quickly may be considered more humane than those that create casualties, requiring extended medical intervention. The diplomatic correspondence revealed interesting cultural differences in approaching the laws of war. German legal arguments relied heavily on theoretical interpretations of international law and abstract concepts of military honor. American responses focused on practical comparisons with accepted weapons and empirical evidence of battlefield effectiveness. This difference in approach would influence international legal discussions about weapons regulations for decades after the war. The execution threat contained in the German protest was particularly significant because it represented an escalation beyond traditional prisoner of war treatment. International law recognized the right to try prisoners for war crimes, but the German threat to execute Americans simply for carrying legally issued weapons was unprecedented in modern warfare. Legal experts in neutral countries noted that the German position, if implemented, would effectively allow any nation to define enemy weapons as illegal and execute prisoners accordingly. The practical impact of the German protest on American military operations was minimal. American commanders continued to deploy trench guns according to established tactical doctrine, and production of military shotguns actually increased during the final months of the war. Winchester and Remington received additional contracts for trench guns, suggesting that American military leadership viewed the German protest as confirmation of the weapon's effectiveness rather than cause for reconsideration. Intelligence reports from German prisoners captured after September 19th revealed that the diplomatic protest had actually backfired within German military ranks. Many frontline soldiers interpreted the formal complaint as admission by their own government that German forces could not effectively counter American trench gun tactics. Morale reports from German divisions facing American forces showed declining confidence and increasing requests for reassignment to sectors where American shotgun teams were not active. The German execution threat proved to be entirely hollow. Despite capturing numerous American soldiers carrying trench guns during October and November 1918, German forces executed none of them for weapons possession. This restraint was likely influenced by American warnings about reprisals, but also by the practical reality that Germany was increasingly dependent on prisoner exchanges as its military situation deteriorated. American intelligence agencies used the German protest as propaganda material, distributing translated copies to Allied forces as evidence of German desperation. The fact that Germany felt compelled to make diplomatic protests about American weapons was presented as proof that American military innovation was achieving decisive tactical advantages. Some American units reportedly began displaying captured copies of the German protest as morale-boosting evidence of their effectiveness. The international legal community followed the shotgun controversy with considerable interest. Neutral legal experts generally supported the American position, noting that the German interpretation of unnecessary suffering was so broad that it could potentially prohibit most effective military weapons. Swiss legal scholar Max Huber wrote in a contemporary analysis, "If buckshot pellets constitute unnecessary suffering, then artillery fragments, which create similar multiple wound patterns, would be equally prohibited." The German position appears to be selective application of humanitarian law designed to eliminate enemy advantages rather than protect human welfare. The controversy extended beyond purely military and diplomatic circles. American newspapers covered the German protest extensively, generally portraying it as evidence of American military superiority and German desperation. The New York Times editorialized that the enemy finds it necessary to protest our soldiers' equipment through diplomatic channels, suggests that our boys are giving them more than they can handle on the battlefield. The Hun's complaint about our hunting guns is the finest tribute to American ingenuity and fighting spirit that we could ask for. German newspapers, operating under wartime censorship, presented the protest as evidence of American violations of civilized warfare. However, even German coverage inadvertently confirmed the effectiveness of American weapons by focusing on their impact on German forces. The Berliner Tageblatt noted, The American hunting weapons have created conditions on the Western Front that require diplomatic intervention to restore adherence to international humanitarian law. The shotgun controversy also influenced post-war weapons development and international law. The effectiveness demonstrated by American trench guns led to continued military interest in shotgun-type weapons for close combat. Police and military forces worldwide began evaluating shotguns for urban operations and interior fighting, applications that bore clear resemblance to trench warfare conditions. International legal discussions about weapons regulation in the post-war period frequently referenced the shotgun controversy as an example of how technological innovation could challenge existing legal frameworks. The League of Nations arms control discussions included specific consideration of weapons that fired multiple projectiles simultaneously, though no international agreements restricting such weapons were ultimately adopted. By November 11, 1918, when the armistice ended active combat, the German diplomatic protest against American shotguns had become a historical footnote. The weapons that Germany had sought to ban through international pressure had contributed to the systematic dismantling of German defensive positions during the final months of the war. American trench gun teams had demonstrated that innovative tactics and appropriate technology could overcome defensive advantages that had stymied European forces for 4 years. The transformation was complete. Weapons that German soldiers had mocked as hunting toys in July 1918 had become so effective by September that the German government felt compelled to make formal diplomatic protests. The trench brooms had swept away not only German defensive positions, but also German assumptions about American military capabilities. In the end, the shotgun controversy stood as testament to a fundamental truth of military innovation. Effectiveness matters more than convention, and victory belongs to those who adapt most successfully to changing tactical realities. The German soldiers who had laughed at American shotguns discovered that the last laugh belonged to the Americans. The weapons they had dismissed as farmers' tools had proven to be exactly what trench warfare required: brutal, effective instruments, designed not for the parade ground, but for the intimate, terrifying reality of close combat in the trenches of the Western Front.